Certainly glad to have you this morning. Thank you so much for joining us here. Baptism Sunday is always an exciting time for us here at the church. If you are visiting with us for the first time, wow, like we have people on the floor again. We are so incredibly excited for what God is doing. Just as a reminder, we do have a 9:30 service. Has a little more space in it than the 11:15 does. We've been working on a series titled Don't Manipulate Your Promise. I think this is something like week 8 or 9 or something. I don't know. I've lost count at this point. Last week was Easter. We looked at the similarities of the story of Abraham and Isaac we found in Genesis chapter 22 with the story of Jesus and his crucifixion. We found a lot of parallels and a lot of ways that we could pull that information together. I thought this week it'd be good if we went back and looked at Genesis chapter 22 again this week, because I believe there's some more stuff that God wants to teach us and needs to teach us. How many believe this morning that the Word of God is alive and active? Alive and active. What that means is that it doesn't matter how many times we read a passage of Scripture, we can get something new from it each and every time. And I believe that God's going to allow us to do that today from Genesis chapter 22. We'll begin in verse 1. It says this: sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. This testing wasn't so God could see if Abraham would respond. It was not to see if Abraham would be obedient in this moment. You must understand that God is an all-knowing God. God knows everything. He knew long before he ever shouted out the name Abraham, he knew that Abraham would respond. Would it be all right if I came right for your throat, first part of the sermon, right from the get-go? Listen, what if what you're going through right now isn't God trying to see how you'll respond, but so you can see just how far you've come? Listen. This word for testing can also mean prove. It means that he proved him. He allowed a time of proof, not so God could see how far he came. He already knew how far he had come. He needed Abraham to see just how far he had come. He had come from being a manipulator of the promise to now embracing the promise. Listen, if we look back on our life just 6 years ago, just 6 months ago, just 6 weeks ago, just 6 days ago, just 6 minutes ago, we would have to shout, for the joy of the Lord is inside of us, is our strength, and we have come so far from where we were before. Woo! Wow, whoa, wow. I don't think you realize that. Listen, the devil doesn't want you to remember how far you've come. That's the reason why he keeps throwing shame up in your face over and over again, because the moment you realize just how far God has brought you from, the enemy will lose whatever grip he has on you in your life. So you need to give God about 15 seconds this morning, praising him for just how far he's brought you. Yes! Woo! I am thankful I am not who I was. I am thankful I don't have to be that person anymore. I'm thankful that it doesn't matter how many times the enemy tries to remind me of that or tries to show me I haven't progressed as far as I want to, that I can still take him back to who I was before I met Jesus, to who I was before I had an encounter with Jesus, before who I was before God set me on the path that I am right now. I am thankful. I am thankful for a little perspective in my walk with the Lord. Listen, perspective is all about seeing what I'm going through right now and the struggle that I may be facing and looking at that as compared to how I would have handled myself a year ago, how I would have handled myself 6 weeks ago. But God has brought me to the place now where I can look with a clear perspective to know I am so much farther in my walk than I was. Woo! Sometimes we need a little perspective. A little perspective just to remind us that we are not who we tried so desperately to get away from. Abraham is not a promise manipulator any longer. He's embracing, not manipulating the promise. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Notice the posture of listening here. Notice how Abraham is listening here. God spoke and Abraham made himself available. God spoke and immediately he responded, "Here I am." I don't know who needs to hear that this morning, but God is speaking to you, and what he expects as a response to you or from you is not your excuses, not your reasons why you can't, not the reasons why you won't, but instead just saying back to God, "Here I am." Come on, say that out loud. Here I am. Come on, one more time. Here I am. Woo! I wonder, are we really making ourselves available to God's calling though? Are we really making ourselves available to God's calling? When God calls our name, are we listening? Are we listening? Have you learned what God's voice sounds like? Do you know what it sounds like? Because many times I think that we expect to hear God's voice like it was with Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. We want this deep beaming, "Moses" type of response from God. That's not how it always happens. Sometimes it happens in the stillness and the quietness. Listen, the most I hear from God is during my quiet time with him. I don't expect to hear from him in the big booming moments. I need it in the quietness of my life. Or have I forgotten what the voice of God sounds like in my life? Look at verse 2. Then God said. I could preach a whole sermon just on those 3 words. Then God said. Why is that so important? Notice that God didn't speak again until after he had Abraham's attention. He didn't say to him, "Abraham, let me go ahead and tell you everything I need to tell you." No, he said, "Abraham," he said, "here I am." Then he responded back to him. I've shared this with you before, but I think it's a good reminder. God doesn't waste breath. God doesn't waste breath. When God speaks, it is to attack what area of your life is insufficient. So you better be thankful that God is speaking to you, because you can know that if he's still working on you, if he's still speaking on you, that he wouldn't waste his breath on something he didn't see was headed on the other side of what you're going through right now. "Oh, I'm not hearing from God," you might say. "He just doesn't speak to me that way." Maybe it's less about your hearing and it's more about your listening. Maybe it's less about hearing, and you do realize there's a difference between hearing and listening. I can hear all kinds of things, but I have to hone in to listen to what's going on. Has anyone ever called out your name and you pretend not to hear them? Listen, there's somebody in my family who's notorious for that. I don't want to even point out who it is. But sometimes that will happen. We will speak a name or say a name, and they'll act like you didn't even hear what you said. Didn't even hear it. Why? Because we don't want to allow ourselves to be confined to that conversation, or we think the expectation they're going to have from us is too severe. So we don't even want to be around that person. Maybe they get on my nerves. Maybe they annoy me. So I might have heard them, but I'm not listening to them. I heard it, but I don't want to listen. Let me also give you this example. Have you ever been talking to someone before and you can tell they're distracted and not paying attention to you? You don't know what I'm talking about. Like, you're just pouring out your heart to somebody and all you're getting back from them is and you say, well, I'm about to die. And they're like, I have a terminal illness, They're not paying any attention to you. So what do we say to somebody who's not listening to us? We say, are you listening? We don't say, are you hearing? We say, are you listening? Now listen, I already cleared this with her ahead of time, so you all already need to know I'm not going to be in the doghouse for saying this. It's also the reason I brought her up on the stage here. Angela will be the first to admit to you, she talks to herself sometimes. Whether it's in the kitchen when she's cooking, whether she's going around the house, she's talking to herself. As a matter of fact, she sat down last night. I was like, boom, this was already in my notes, but it proved my point. She sat down last night. She started saying something. I said, what? She said, never mind. I was just talking to myself. But listen, I might hear her, but sometimes because she talks to herself, I don't really listen to what she's saying. I'm not really listening. If she wants to make sure I'm listening, then she has to ensure she has my attention. She needs my eye contact. She needs me to be engaged in conversation. Listen, it's not enough to just be hearing what the Word of God says. It needs to be listening. I need to be engaged with it. I need to be making eye contact. I need to allow myself to be engaged in the conversation. You may be hearing God call your name, but that doesn't mean you're listening. Why? Because you're distracted. You're distracted. You're distracted. You're distracted. As a matter of fact, we don't even know people by their face anymore. We know them by the top of their heads. Why? Because that's all we ever see anymore. It's just the top of people's heads. And we start to associate who they are by the top of people's heads. Listen, for some of us, unless God sends a notification on our phone, we will never hear him. Woo! Unless a notification comes up that catches our attention, we're just going to swipe right on by it and keep right on going. Listen, one of the worst things that could have happened to us was the invention of a smartphone. And why do I say that to you? No, Pastor, I'm connected to all my friends. No, you're not. You're connected to the life you want them to see. Woo, don't even get me started on that. Your Facebook life isn't nearly as perfect as you want it to be. You want everyone to believe everything's great and everything's falling apart in your life. And then what's happening then is the reflection of someone else trying to live up to an expectation you can't even have for yourself. Listen, I've been building up some Facebook rants for a while. I've been having these TikTok moments in my brain where I've been wanting to share some stuff with you, but I've been holding back on it. What I'm saying to you this morning is that we have become so distracted that we don't even hear other people, let alone the voice of God. I've said to you before, the devil knows he can't defeat you, so instead he'll distract you. He'll distract you. He'll get you to a place where you're not paying any attention to the voice of God any longer because everything is so important to you. I shared it in the first service. I really wish we could rewind the clock about 30 years and go back to the home phone. You know, the one that hangs on the wall with the 50-foot cable that's all wound up. Some of you aren't even old enough to realize what that is. But you couldn't get a hold of somebody unless they were actually home. And that's the only time you could get a hold of them. And if you didn't want to talk to them, you would push them right to your answering machine. You know, you're the one you had to record with 2 fingers. That's what I wish we could go back to. Is the moments where we could just get rid of this stuff because it might seem like a convenience, but what it really is a distraction. It's a distraction in our lives. It's a distraction. I feel like I always have to be available. I feel like if I don't respond within 3 minutes, they're going to think I'm mad and angry with them because I don't have any emotion in my texting. I don't know what to send back, so I don't send anything back. And now I know they're mad at me. And now I've created an entire hypothetical situation from absolutely nothing. Whew, that wasn't even in my notes. You're welcome. See, in order to listen to God, you have to make yourself available. I must give God my attention. That's the problem with a lot of us is we don't give God any attention. We don't allow our attention to be in tune with God. We want God to speak to us, but we want him to speak to us through someone else's post or through someone else's text or through someone else's word of encouragement. Listen, if you're only eating off of my plate on a Sunday morning, you will be very disappointed in your relationship with God. This is a personal one-on-one relationship that you have with him. He needs your attention. Listen, I hear with my ears. I listen with my attention. I hear with my ears, but I listen when I have my attention set on something. God doesn't want your ear. God wants your attention. The enemy has used distraction in our lives to the point where we don't even listen for the voice of God any longer. I want to ask you a question this morning. What has your attention? What has your attention? Is it situational? Is it always chasing the next thing? Is your attention based on someone that you hope needs you because it will make you not have to deal with your own pain as long as you're trying to fix someone else? Where is my attention at this morning? Look at verse 2. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. See, Abraham didn't just hear. Abraham didn't just listen. Abraham responded. Since God doesn't waste breath, then maybe the reason he isn't speaking to you is because he knows you won't respond. What if the reason why God is not speaking to you right now is because he already knows you're not going to respond anyway, so why waste his breath? You're not going to respond anyway. You're going to do what you want to do anyway. So God is not going to speak to you in your situation because your mind has already been made up and God himself won't change it. Maybe the reason why is because you won't. That's going to hit somebody just right this morning. Just right this morning. If you're not hearing from God, you need to understand that's not a him problem. God didn't somehow forget how to speak. God didn't somehow forget how to get your attention. But God's not going to try to get your attention when he knows you won't respond anyway. So God is not going to waste his time or his breath speaking to you when you have no intention of allowing it to transform your mind and your heart anyway. Now, I didn't say that you have to have all the faith at once. But you've been shutting him out altogether. You don't have to have all the faith. I don't have to jump from one side of the stage all the way to the other side because God knows if my faith looked like that, I'd probably break some bones in the process. God doesn't need everything from me all at once. What he does need is to see my progress. He needs to see me moving forward, one belief at a time, trusting one promise at a time, moving just a little bit in order to show that I am still allowing myself to be invested. I'm interested and he has my attention. Why would God waste his breath speaking to an unwilling vessel? That's the question I want you to ask yourself this morning. Why would God waste his breath speaking to an unwilling vessel? But notice that Abraham didn't just respond, he responded quickly. It says early the next morning. Abraham was faced with two scenarios. Two scenarios in this situation we find in Genesis chapter 22, and I believe we can agree that both of these scenarios are uncomfortable. Scenario number one, he can do what is required of him, go on a 3-day journey, and sacrifice his promised son. That doesn't sound like a very good situation to me. Option number two, he can choose to act as if he didn't hear God, and he can walk in disobedience. Listen, walking in disobedience to God doesn't sound like a very good option to me either. So he's faced between a situation where both of the outcomes seem to be very difficult. And we don't know what to do when we're faced with a situation that's difficult. And both of the outcomes seem negative to us. Abraham is faced with the same thing you were faced with. It's called the double bind. The double bind says that I'm faced with a situation, and I know if I do this thing, this will happen, and it won't be pleasant. And I know if I do this thing, this will happen, it still won't be pleasant. This is going to hit someone this morning. You didn't realize you came to a counseling session, but I'm getting ready to share with you what the double bind looks like for you in your life. Do I have any other procrastinators in the room? Like most of us, right? Procrastinators. Let me talk to us for just a moment. Many times the reason why I procrastinate is because I'm faced with a situation which I don't know the outcome and I don't like the outcome. So I choose to act as if the situation doesn't exist. I act like it's not even there. So I procrastinate, whether it's a chore around the house or whatever it may be. I find myself procrastinating about those situations because the outcome is going to cost me something and I don't want anything to do with that. Let me give it to you this way as this example. You have a difficult problem in front of you. I'm going to give you about 3 seconds to determine what that is. It shouldn't take you much longer than that. You have something difficult in front of you, a decision that you're going to have to make. It may be a school project. Could be a home improvement project. You have a fear of failure. Anyone else have that fear besides me? I have a fear of failure. You all don't realize what goes through my brain every Sunday morning when I'm coming into church. You might get to see me up here and think, oh, he's just so confident. No, I'm not. I'm terrified, not because I'm scared of you. I'm terrified I won't say enough. I'll say too much. I have all of these fear of failures inside of me. God, what if I don't get it right? What if it doesn't work out right? And about 98% of the time when I walk off the stage, I'm more discouraged than I was when I got up here. Because I'm wondering, did I get it right? Did I fail? Is somebody going to complain? Is our neighbor across the road going to call us again and say our music is too loud? Because that keeps happening. What's going to happen? This fear of failure is real for me. And it is for a lot of us because maybe we've been raised. I wasn't raised this way, but maybe you were. Maybe you were raised that you could never get it right. Maybe you were never able to get it right. Maybe your parents didn't love you or you didn't think they loved you because you didn't meet their expectations. I don't know what it is. There's a multitude of reasons why we feel this fear of failure inside of us. But when we have this fear of failure, we don't want to approach a project because we're afraid. What if I get it wrong? What if I mess up? What if I don't do well? Is that going to define who I am because of my failure? So we don't do it. So we're faced with a decision. Do we press past the fear of failure? Do we press past and complete the project, knowing there's a real good chance we might mess up along the way? Or do we procrastinate by watching YouTube videos or TikTok all day? Which one do I want to do? See, the first one is the more difficult one. It's the one that leads to a sense of accomplishment. But the second one, when I choose that one, sure, I get to escape for a little while. I get to get away from the pain or whatever it is that is associated with that. But the project isn't going to go away. Just because I pretend it doesn't exist doesn't mean it's going to go away. Instead of what happens is, when I finally do have to do it, now there's less time for me to do it. I feel more pressure to get it done. You all follow me so far? Let me give you another example. You need to have a difficult conversation with someone. But you don't want to because you have a fear of rejection. Listen, anyone else struggle with the fear of rejection? Some of you are too afraid to even raise your hand. You struggle with a fear of rejection. I have a difficult conversation I need to have with someone, but I don't want to have it because I fear rejection. You can either have the difficult conversation and face your fear of rejection, or you can keep putting it off and keep piling more wood on the fire of your anger or resentment or bitterness toward that individual. The choice is yours. See, each time we choose procrastination, each time we choose it, we continue to feel more and more overwhelmed inside of ourselves. We begin to feel more overwhelmed. Each time I procrastinate and I push something back, it makes me feel more and more overwhelmed. And for those of us in recovery, when we become so overwhelmed, then our brain starts screaming at us that we know the way out. We know how to make all this go away. We know how to make all this pain just disappear. We can do it. Just do it this one time. You don't have to do it again. And our brain just screams and screams and screams at us. Why? Because we procrastinated. We pushed all of these emotions off to the side. We were unwilling to deal with those. And when we're unwilling to deal with those, you better believe they're going to come back. But the next time they come back, they're going to be worse than they were the first time. We're going to find ourselves dealing with more and more emotions, more difficult than they were the last time. Why? Because we procrastinated. Why? Because we made one compromise at a time. Listen, this is what's true about this, and this is what I'm learning from myself. The choice you should make in the double bind is the one that's the least comfortable. The one that is the least comfortable. Well, what's comfortable for me in these scenarios? What's comfortable for me is to act like they don't exist and to run away from them and to binge on media or to get on my phone. Listen, I've had more apps taken off my phone in the last 2 or 3 months. I have almost as many taken off as I have on my phone. Why? Because I kept looking for more and more opportunities to be distracted so I didn't have to deal with stuff. And the longer we do that, the longer we allow ourselves to not process the pain we need to process, then the more overwhelming it will become for us in our lives. But Abraham didn't have any interest in that. He had decided he was not going to manipulate the promise any longer. Instead, he was going to move quickly. So it says that he rose early the next morning. The question for you this morning is what double binds are you facing in your life? What double binds are you facing? What's going on in your life? What's a reality right now that you're running away from? And I want you at some point today to make a list. I want you to make a list of some things that are pressing right now in your life, some decisions that you need to make. And I want you to write out how long you've been running from these decisions. And as you've been running from these decisions, I want you to see what the consequences have been from your running. And then I want you to make a commitment. I want you to put it right on your notepad how many days you have to accomplish what you need to accomplish. And don't put it off too long. You might be saying, Pastor, why don't you just get back to preaching instead of doing all this counseling stuff? No, because this is necessary for us in our lives. This is necessary for us to hear. And some of you are unwilling to sit in a counseling session, so I have to do it here because that's the only way you'll hear it. Woo. Now, another thing that stuck out to me about Abraham in this story was that he loaded his own donkey and he cut his own firewood. Abraham is believed to have been, he was well over 100 years old by this point. He was well over 100 years old and he's chopping his own wood and he's loading his own donkey, but he takes 2 servants with him. I had to ask myself, God, why did he do that? He had servants that could have taken care of it. Now, most of the commentaries that I read said that it was because he was real anxious, that he was nervous about what was about to happen. He couldn't sleep, so he stayed up all night. He took care of the donkey and he took care of the firewood. I don't think that had anything to do with it. I don't tend to go against what commentators say often, but I believe at this point, he was so tired of manipulating the promise, he was going to do whatever God asked him to do. So then I have to ask myself, why did he do this then? And God shared with me the reason why he did it is because Abraham realized he had to put in the work. He had to put in the work for where God was calling him to. In other words, Abraham didn't rely on someone else to do what he was capable of doing. He didn't ask someone else to do for him what he was unwilling to do for himself. Too many times we want others to participate at a greater level than we're willing to. We want other people to participate and do for us what we won't do for ourselves. But Abraham said, listen, I'll chop the wood, I'll load the donkey, you guys go along with us, but I'm going to put the work in. It's going to be me that puts the work in. No one else is going to get my blessing. I'm going to see this all the way through. From beginning to end, it's my blessing, it's my trial, it's my situation. I'm going to see it through. Verse 5, he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. As we discussed last week, we will worship and then we will come back. Listen, he's about to sacrifice his son. How on earth can he say we will come back? Because he had a faith to believe that even if, I don't know who needed to hear that, even if the worst case scenario happens and he has to murder and sacrifice his son, he believed strongly that God would raise him back up from the dead because he is the promised son. He is the son with whom the promise is going to come through. And how can he allow that promise to take place if he's dead? So he believed. He believed with everything in him. Even if the worst case scenario, I know God will bring him back and we will come back together. Abraham had learned at this point to trust the promiser more than the promise. See, when we trust the promiser, we don't have to understand the process. When we trust the promiser, the process is irrelevant. What we think of the process is irrelevant. The process of itself is necessary for us in our life. But when we trust the promiser, it doesn't matter what the process looks like, because we know the promiser is going to do what's good and best and perfect for us in our lives to get us where we need to be. Abraham stopped trusting the promise. He stopped trusting the process. He started trusting the promiser. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. He himself carried the fire and the knife as the two of them went on together. This went on together means the two of them went in agreement. They both went in agreement for the offering. What I also found interesting about this is it says that he himself carried the fire and the knife. That spoke to my heart because I had to be honest. I think I might have done everything else, but I might have forgotten the knife. I might have carried the wood. I might have chopped it. I might have carried the fire. I might have made sure the sacrifice was there. The ropes were there to bind the sacrifice. Listen, this is good for somebody this morning. You've been trusting God for so much. You've been allowing him to do so much in your life. You've been willing to take the sacrifice, take the wood, take the fire, take the ropes, allow the sacrifice to be laid up on the altar, but then you're like, oh, I forgot the knife. Oh, God, well, I guess we can't do this now. Why? Because I'm still trying to manipulate and control the promise. Listen, God has led you to this place. God has brought you here. You don't get to choose which objects you want to use and leave at home when it comes to God working in your life. He had to carry that knife with him for 3 days, 60 miles. 60-mile journey. For 3 days, he carried this knife along with him as a constant reminder of what he was going to have to do. At any point, he could have just dropped that bad boy off in the sand and said, you know what, I don't think I'm really going to need that anyway. But he didn't. He took whatever was necessary into the season that God, that is good for someone. He took whatever was necessary to see God's promise be fulfilled into the season he didn't want to go in, but he went into it anyway because he trusts the promiser over the promise. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham's had 3 days now, a 3-day journey, 60 miles traveling with his son, with the fire, with the knife, with the wood, and with the sacrifice. But he didn't tell Isaac too early that he was going to be the sacrifice. Listen, not every detail is going to be available to you as you make this journey of faith. You might get some of it. God might give you enough details to make sure that you are walking the path of obedience, but it doesn't mean he'll give you the whole picture. So here Isaac is saying, Father, where's the sacrifice? Where's the lamb for this? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. God himself will provide what is necessary for us in this season of our life, my son. God himself will do for us what we're unwilling to do for ourselves. Listen, Isaac, all God asks us to do, all he's asked us to do is be obedient. All he's asked you to do, Isaac, all I'm asking you to do is carry the wood. I've got the fire. I've got the knife. You just be obedient. Just keep walking. Just keep walking. Just keep walking. Up the hill we go. Up the hill we go. Doesn't matter what the sacrifice is. Doesn't matter where it's going to come from. God will provide the need. God will provide what is necessary for us, son. Just keep walking. Listen, I don't know who needed to hear that this morning, but just keep walking. Just keep walking. You don't have to have all the answers. You won't have all the answers. Just keep walking. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar. And there he arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, last week I shared with you that Isaac was probably a teenager at this point, but as I did more studying on that this week, most Jewish scholars think he was actually in his 30s at this point. I wish I had known that last week, because Jesus was 33 when he was crucified, and now they're saying Isaac was in his 30s as well. There's another similarity in the story we had last week. But why do I bring that up? Whether he's a teenager or whether he's in his 30s, he could have easily gotten away from Abraham. Abraham is at least 110, 112, 130, 133. We don't know. He's well advanced in years. Isaac could easily have run away from his father, but he didn't. Why? Because he trusted his father's heart. He knew that his father had his best interest at heart. It didn't make any sense. He's getting bound up. He's getting bound up. He's getting laid down on the altar. He had to be thinking to himself, what in the world's going on? But I'm just going to keep trusting the Father. I'm just going to keep trusting the heart of my Father. This doesn't make any sense to me, but I'm just going to keep trusting the heart of my Father. Listen, that's good for you today. You don't understand what's going on. All God's requiring of you is to lay yourself out as a sacrifice, to put yourself in an uncomfortable position, not to think you have to have all the answers. He just needs you to lay yourself out in a position of vulnerability, because that's when the answer is going to come. He had to willingly submit to his father and lay himself on the altar. He was willing to do this because of the trust he had in Abraham. My question for you today is, do you trust the Father like Isaac did? Do you trust God to the same level that Isaac trusted Abraham? Listen, I think it's easy for us to trust that for everyone else. I believe God will move mountains for my neighbor. I believe God will move mountains for people in this church. But I don't believe he'll move mountains for me. I'm not worth it. I'm not worthy. Listen, it's time we stop believing in promises for other people and start believing in promises for ourselves. It's time we stop allowing ourselves to trust God enough for other people, and time we start trusting God enough for ourselves. I'm going to trust God in my situation. I'm going to trust God with what's going on in my life right now. Yeah, I'm still going to trust it for you too, but listen, I'm going to be a little bit jealous right here. Right now, I'm going to be a little bit selfish with my situation, and I'm going to say God's going to move in my situation. I'm going to trust God for my situation. Verse 10, then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Can you imagine? But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And watch what he said. Here I am. What did he say before the trial? Here I am. What did he say during the trial? Here I am. That's an amazing thought. Regardless of what the situation was, here I am. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Not only does Abraham chop the wood, not only does he load his own donkey, not only does he travel for 3 days, not only does he bind up his son and lay him on the altar, now he's willing to go through with it. He's actually going to do this thing. There's no more playing anymore. It's now to the point where it has to happen. See, last week we learned that he was willing to do that because he believed the promise enough to know that even if he took his son out, even if he took his life, he knew that God would bring him back and resurrect Isaac. But the angel, who's believed to be Jesus himself, stops him. The pre-incarnate Jesus stops him. Think about that for just a moment. The sufficient sacrifice stops the insufficient sacrifice from happening. And on the same hill where Abraham offered Isaac is believed to be the same hill where Jesus would lay himself down on the same wood Maybe not the same exact wood, but the same semblance of wood. He allowed himself to be laid out and stretched. He allowed himself to be crucified as the sufficient sacrifice, as we talked about last week. Listen, Jesus points out our insufficiencies. He points out why we're not sufficient enough. But then he says, but I am. I'm sufficient enough. I will take the burden. I will take the pain. I will take the punishment. Verse 13, Abraham looked up there in the thicket and he saw the ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Why? Because you have obeyed me. The reason why I will continue with the promise, the reason why you will see the fulfillment of this promise, Abraham, is because you've stopped manipulating the promise and you have now embraced it. So I'm going to give you exactly what I promised you. I'm going to give you descendants that outnumber the stars of the sky. I'll give you descendants that will outnumber the sand on the seashore. Abraham, I will do exactly as I told you I would. Why? Because you were obedient. Because you have obeyed me. As the band comes this morning, I want to ask you 3 questions. I want you to reflect. We ask at this time that no one other than the band move around. Will be just a few more minutes. This is the most crucial, important time of the entire sermon. I want you to ask yourself these questions. Number 1, does God have your ear or does God have your attention? Does God have your ear or does God have your attention? Are you listening to God or are you too distracted to hear him? It's time we put distractions away. Whatever that is for you. It can be a multitude of things. It doesn't have to be your phone. Some of y'all have been using relationships as distractions for a lot longer than phones. You've been using other people as a distraction to not have to deal with what you need to deal with. Whatever that distraction may be, are you listening to God or are you so distracted you can't hear him anymore? The second question I want you to ask yourself is, what are some double binds in your life? And how do you need to rely on God more to help you through those? You've been acting as though they don't exist. These difficult conversations, these difficulties that you have, whatever the scenario may be. You're trying to act like it doesn't exist in a hope that eventually it will go away. But please understand this morning, it won't go away. It'll just get worse. So whatever that situation may be, take the least comfortable road. Just make sure you do it with God. The third question I want you to ask yourself is, do you trust the promiser more than the promise? God, I know what the promise is for my life, but I don't like the process. I've said it over and over again. We don't get to choose the process by which the promise comes. God chooses it because he knows what's necessary for you in your life. He knows what's necessary for your surrender. He knows what's necessary for you to get to the next phase, the next season of your life. He knows what needs to happen, so he gives you just what you need. So not only do you trust the promiser more than the promise, do you trust the promiser more than the process? Do you trust God more than what you can see? Because I don't like what he's doing right now. I don't like what God's doing in my life. He's stripping control away from me, one decision at a time. And I'm not a big fan of this, God. I don't like feeling vulnerable. I don't like feeling out of control. Why? Because as weird as it is, it's familiar. Even though I know it will hurt me, even though I know it will cause me tremendous pain, it's familiar. It's the easier road. It's my double bind. In the program that I'm going through, I realized that the double bind for me was my problem and continues to be my problem. As long as I procrastinate enough, my brain will tell me I need something to escape from. But when I walk confidently through situations that are uncomfortable for me, through the help of accountability, through the help of the Lord, I find they weren't nearly as bad as I thought they were. And even when I did mess up, God promised to never leave me or forsake me. It doesn't get any better than that. It doesn't matter if the whole world abandons me. It doesn't matter if the whole world rejects me. Let him reject me. I've got Jesus on my side. That's more than enough. Oh, I can feel that spirit of rejection this morning. You have been dealing with that spirit of rejection for far too long. And it's time for you to attack it head on. You are not who you told yourself you are. You're not who your parents have told you you are. You're not who a relationship told you you are. You're a child of God this morning. Amen. And that rejection that you're feeling, that didn't come from God. He hasn't rejected you. Oh, I feel like we just need to sit there for just a moment. You are not the sum of your rejections. They don't define you. They have, but they won't. You're faced with that double bind this morning. Well, will I call it out? Will I attack it? Will I surrender it to God? Or will I keep trying to manipulate it like I have been all along? Some of us have kept these things around longer than we do our pets. We've relied on them longer than we've relied on anything. We bind that spirit of rejection in the name of Jesus. You must go. Release them and let them free. Fear of failure. Maybe it's our own expectation. Maybe it's the expectation someone else has placed on us. But you're facing that this morning. You just don't want to mess up, so you don't do anything. You're afraid you'll make the wrong move, so you do nothing. And in doing nothing, you make the wrong move. Doesn't matter what I do, whether I do or I don't, I'm always a failure. No, you're not. No, you're not. And if you haven't heard this in a while, I love you. Maybe someone needed to hear that today. God loves you. And that's more than enough. I'm not the sum of my failures. I'm not the sum of my rejection. I'm not the sum of my doubt. I'm not the sum of my worry. I'm not any of those things. So my double bind is before me this morning. Do I attack those things? Do I stop believing the lies? Because it's going to be difficult. It's going to hurt. It's going to be hard. Or do I continue to act like they don't exist? Choose the more difficult path. Choose what feels like the more difficult path. And you'll find your freedom. Father, I can feel your presence in here right now, stirring the hearts of people. You've pointed out to people some issues this morning in their life that they've been calling struggles, but it's actually how they define themselves. They've been calling themselves these names so long they've forgotten who they really are. God, whisper in their ear, child, you're my child. Allow them to feel that this morning, God. Allow it to transform them. They are not rejected. They are loved. They are not a failure. They're enough. They're not insufficient. They're just who you made them. Help them to realize that this morning. God, I pray that you'll give them the courage this morning give them the courage to face the double bind. To step out of the fantasy that they believe it will all go away because it's destroying them. On the inside, God, they're robbed of joy and peace. The things that you promised to give us are not present because it's been robbing them. God, help them to realize this morning, if they don't face this double bind, they continue to procrastinate or act like it doesn't exist, that the enemy will use that as a tool to pull us closer and closer and closer to falling away. And maybe you could testify of that this morning. And what took you out the last time is threatening to take you out again. Why? Because you never dealt with it the first time, and you're still failing to deal with it now. It's right in front of you. The double bind is there. Maybe you need someone to help walk through this with you. That's fine. Be willing to step out. Be willing to ask for help. Walk through this season God has for you right now. He's calling it out in you. You've taken the wood, you've taken the fire, you've taken the rope, you've taken the sacrifice, you've forgotten the knife. God needs the last piece. He needs you to carry everything up the hill. Because Jesus carried everything up the hill. He carried your shame, your rejection, your insecurity. They nailed it all on the cross. It died there with Jesus. Satan lost his power. And then we celebrate the resurrected Jesus, who conquered death, who conquered the devil, and is seated now at the right hand of God, making intercession for you right now in this moment. As you pray to God, Jesus is making intercession on your behalf. God, give them peace in this moment. I said, I don't know how you need to respond this morning, but however you need to respond, you go ahead and do it. Don't wait on me. If you need to come up here and pray, you come up here and pray. You don't have to wait for the music to start. You're going to face the double bind today. You're going to face it head on. You're going to decide with God's strength, you're going to walk through this thing. You're going to unload and unpack these years of heartache you've been carrying around. With the help of Jesus and with the help of the community. The family that God has joined you to. God, give them strength today. Give them the courage today. Give them the boldness to make this decision. You are life, you are love, you give light to the darkness, you give hope, you